Hi everyone, my name is Thomas Strawn, and my paper here will be looking at the relationship between Jeremy Corbyn and his shadow cabinet, which is a wider part of my PhD thesis about how Corbyn managed dissent within the Labour Party. As you can see from the subtitle, Fighting with No Solution, it wasn't a very good relationship. I don't think that will shock anyone who has followed the Labour Party. So first we'll do a little bit of sort of overview. How the shadow cabinet works with the Labour Party. The leader of the Labour Party selects a shadow cabinet. That's been the case ever since Ed Miliband scrapped the shadow cabinet elections. So the leader is entirely responsible for picking the shadow cabinet. It's the people he wants. The shadow cabinet then assists with formulating policy that goes into the manifesto. So the shadow defense minister helps write the defense policy. The shadow DEFRA minister helps write the environmental and rural affairs stuff. And but the cabinet is bound by collective responsibility. The idea that if members of the shadow cabinet cannot agree on a decision, they must either go with the majority or they must resign. Right, and that includes the leader. The leader is first amongst equals. So despite choosing the shadow cabinet, the leader is bound by the decisions of the shadow cabinet. If necessary, due to something that's happened really quickly, something that needs an immediate response, a policy can be made by the relevant member of the shadow cabinet, and that policy is the party policy until the shadow cabinet can vote on the issue. So it's a collaborative environment, and you usually need to be able to get on with the people you work with. So, Corbyn was elected the leader of the Labour Party without the support of most MPs. Right? I spoke to 15 MPs. Of those, 3 of them are in the shadow cabinet. 7 of them are shadow ministers. Some of them are not MPs anymore. And as you can see, Corbyn got the vote of one of them, who wasn't an MP in 2015 and lost the seat in 2019. So by and large, most of the MPs I spoke to did not back Corbyn. The actual figures favor Andy Burnham a little bit more than Yvette Cooper. I guess just I got lucky, and MPs who supported Cooper all spoke to me. But he was elected. But when Corbyn was elected, most MPs did not vote for him. Most MPs did not support him. He famously only got on the ballot because some MPs allowed him on the ballot without intending to vote for him. So this gave him a challenge. He had to pick a shadow cabinet that could hold the party together. He needed to pick a team that could work. He needed to pick a team that would not be just the few socialist campaign group MPs that had backed him. And most MPs were willing to work with him, right? Barring a few MPs on the Blairite side of the party who said they'd never work with him, almost all MPs across all the parties said they were willing to work with him, they were willing to serve under him as leader. And by and large, there was actually a lot of acceptance of his economic policy, right? Most MPs I spoke to, especially those in domestic policy portfolios when they were shadow ministers, they agreed that his economic policy was pretty good. They liked the fact that there was a rejection of austerity, and they wanted to make that work in particular. So there was a lot of unity within the Labour Party about ending austerity, and about going on a more Keynesian economic direction, which is ironic because Corbyn obviously won. One of the big things that made Corbyn win was the vote on welfare cuts that Labour abstained on. But most MPs I spoke to, they said to me that they were more than happy to follow Corbyn's economic policy. The real sticking point was his foreign policy. Corbyn was always been on the left of foreign policy. He was a chairman of the Stop the War coalition. He opposed not only interventions in Iraq, but in Afghanistan, in Kosovo, in Sierra Leone. He was fully in favor of nuclear disarmament, which is a hot button issue in the Labour Party, but most of the parliamentary party is in favor of keeping Trident. He's generally is out of step with the parliamentary party on foreign policy issues. So Corbyn's initial shadow cabinet was broad and represented a group of small wings of the party. Many moderates thought this was actually not so bad, right? He put close allies into economic policy like John McDonnell, but he put people who were a little more bullish on defense in charge of foreign and defense, right? Hilary Benn, who was sort of a big thinker on the moderate side of the party, he was the shadow foreign secretary, right? Which was a decision that really comforted a lot of people, thinking they thought that he would focus on the economic policy, that's where his allies were, and let the foreign policy be handled by people who thought differently to him, and he'd generally give them free rein, right? That's what most leaders do, right? When Blair focused on areas like education, he put allies in education. He let Brown have chancellor, and then he let Brown do chancellor. He let Brown make up the economic policy. So that was quite favorable. Unfortunately, despite the fact that he picked a diverse shadow cabinet, he wasn't actually listening to them. This is a quote from a shadow defense minister. And indeed, he shows the first flashpoint. The question I asked him was, when is it obvious Corbyn was not interested in working with the shadow cabinet? And he said it was over the intervention of against ISIS in Syria. And Ben gave a speech, which is widely regarded to be a very good speech. Many MPs have said how much they liked that speech, supporting the intervention. Now, there'd been no shadow cabinet meeting on this. So, as I said before, that means that Ben gets to set the policy. Ben was in favor of targeted airstrikes. Corbyn was completely against that. And they eventually made the compromise of a free vote, because while Corbyn wanted to bring the idea of voting against the intervention to the shadow cabinet, it was very obvious he'd lose that vote. But he did that, but he agreed to a free vote after a weekend where shadow cabinet members and Labour MPs came under a huge barrage of abuse from the left of the party for not being behind Corbyn, despite the fact that Ben was the shadow foreign secretary, so it was his area and his right to intervene on the subject, and it's collective responsibility. If the shadow cabinet theoretically wants to push to whip to invade, Corbyn has to go along with that or resign. They very kindly agreed to go for a free vote to avoid such a situation, but Corbyn didn't seem to appreciate that. Right? Another shadow cabinet member who was from a different side of the party to Corbyn basically said that he wasn't influential in his portfolio at all. Corbyn would just make pronouncements, make statements, without consulting shadow ministers, which really annoyed them, and just cut them out entirely. Right? Shadow regional minister said he'd visit their area without telling them, but this came to a head obviously with the Owen Smith leadership campaign, where most of the shadow cabinet resigned and supported Owen Smith. When Corbyn won, he still had to pick a shadow cabinet that had some dissenting voices. He couldn't just fill it with hard left people like John McDonnell and Diane Abbott and Richard Bergen, though he did put them in senior positions and his new shadow cabinet was far more agreeable to him. But there were still people, especially in defence and foreign, who were not behind him. Right? Neil Griffith was not on his side. The shadow defence minister I spoke to said categorically he would not serve in a shadow cabinet that was against Trident. He was in favour of multilateralism, not unilateral disarmament, and he was told that was okay. So, again, after the leadership challenge, Corbyn did realise he had to listen to dissenting voices, and he did not seek to overturn defence policy. And some members of his team, like John McDonnell, did actually try the collaborative approach. But others, like Seamus Milne, would go off script and really annoy shadow ministers. One shadow minister described Seamus Milne as Skeletor. That's how much they hated him. Milne, one particular example from the shadow defense minister was Milne made a statement about opposing a NATO buildup in Estonia, but Labour policy was in favour of that. So he made the statement that Nia Griffith made an opposing statement. Then she was called in to talk about communication. This minister went with her and described what was a shouting match between him and Seamus Milne while Jeremy Corbyn sat there reading the newspaper. So there were people in Corbyn's team that were making these random statements completely at odds with Labour policy, and Corbyn was doing nothing about it, not stepping in, and that was a real problem. However, despite this, actually, there was no real shift of policy in the Labour Party, especially not on foreign policy or defence. Right? So the shadow defence minister basically talks about how Neil Griffith, even for the 2019 manifesto, which was the Corbynite manifesto, Neil Griffith wrote the section on defence herself. And indeed, there was no talk about unilateral disarmament, no talk of pulling out of NATO, right? No policy actually shifted, despite the fact that Corbyn was getting into rows with his own shadow ministers. On domestic policy, there was a broad consensus, right? This is from a shadow health minister, basically saying for 2017 that a lot of his suggestions were recognized. It was a good manifesto. People do like the 2017 manifesto more than the 2019 manifesto. And even on Brexit, which is an area that many party members think Corbyn dropped the ball on, that's not the case, right? This is from a Labour MEP who basically says that like Corbyn's not the hardliner. He wasn't, pro-European, but he actually did manage to balance the dissenting voices between Brexiteers like Burgeon and Lavery, and obviously ardent Remainers like Starmer. He managed to balance that. So actually, in practice, he did forge a consensus, and he didn't actually shift the Labour Party policy all that much. But unfortunately, that still ruined relationships. And what we see is, while the Shadow Cabinet had a wide variety of views in the party, he was not interested in working with them. And though he didn't change the policy very much, his office and his attitude towards these people, towards the moderates in the Shadow Cabinet, was not conducive to a good relationship. And that almost seems kind of self-defeating, right? Either you want to change policy, and then you're going to have the fights. You may win them or lose them, but at least you'll have the fights, and that will lead to a change. Or you don't want to change anything, in which case, why are you fighting with people who you're just going to end up letting them write the manifesto? It's going to create a lot of bad feelings. And that was the vibe that we got from people in the Shadow Cabinet, is that there were a lot of bad feelings at the end because Corbyn just couldn't keep his mouth shut about things like defence and foreign policy, where he was out of step with most of the PLP, out of step with Labour Party policy, which had not changed, and that was pointless and made everyone angry. So yeah, on the whole, Corbyn Shadow Cabinet could have been an area where unity on economic policy was found, and on foreign policy he would have deferred to other people that were more in step with the Labour Party policy. And that is what happened in practice. But Corbyn did not do anything to make it easier, and he fought them, and he caused a lot of unnecessary fights, or didn't step in to stop unnecessary fights from his advisors like Seamus Mahon, who were particularly loathed within the parliamentary party. And that caused a lot of problems. That is why the Shadow Cabinet and him never got on. Thank you.